porn is arguably the most accessible and accessed form of sex education out there. So the results of a survey published in 2021 found that porn was the source of information about sex that was most commonly endorsed by young adults in the US, with almost a quarter of participants stating this. Similar figures have been stated in surveys of adults in the UK as well. So why are people turning to porn as a tool for sex education? One argument could be that this is a way to fill the gaps left behind by sex education taught in schools. And I believe that porn plays a part in normalising a wide variety of sexual interests beyond what we tend to see portrayed in the mainstream. It could also help viewers learn what they may or may not like, all from a place of relative comfort and privacy. It's usually way less daunting to type a question or a desire about sex into a search bar than it is to say it out loud. But it's the context from which we are viewing porn, though, that interests me the most. And tonight I'll be exploring how porn use is linked to parasexuality, how this relates to power, and why censorship may be driven by different motivations than we imagine. So, I'll start by defining parasexuality, or at least the definition that I'm using in this context. So the term was coined by Peter Bailey in a 1990 article in which he describes the 19th century mode of cultural management that was kind of like a sexual inoculation. That is, giving us a little dose of sexuality in an attempt to immunise us from its more harmful effects. So it's a sexuality that is, in his words, deployed but contained, carefully channeled rather than fully discharged. So put simply, parasexuality gives us a taste of what we desire, but ensures that we can never fully indulge. So we're going to take a quick trip back in time to Victorian England to understand, why did this come about as a cultural management tool? So facing huge population growth, a resurgence in syphilis, and a need to get bodies into factories to work hard and birth modern capitalism, desexualization was the order of the day. So this was a time that centered modesty and self-restraint, when it would definitely have been deemed immoral for all of us who've even been here. It was also the era of sexual medicalization, which saw any non-normative sexual behaviours, which included sex outside of marriage, masturbation, and homosexuality, labelled as deviant or even pathological. And reproductive control at the time was being forced disproportionately upon marginalised groups. So basically, in order to maintain the status quo of the privileged, to protect their family lineage and create a civilised society, we were required to shut down our so-called base instincts and focus instead on building nuclear family units. So at the peak of our colonising days, we couldn't be getting distracted by frivolous pursuits of pleasure. So I think they realised that desire always finds a way. And so marital sex, toleration of sex workers in some cities, fashion and partner dancing were socially sanctioned as contained ways to express our sexuality. So what has this whole history lesson got to do with porn? Well, I think the parasexual approach that emerged from those times is more alive today than ever. And let's look at some of the distinguishing features of parasexuality more closely. Number one, distance. There needs to be a separation between the object of desire and the beholder to limit our ability for sexual expression or consummation. The power of parasexuality is keeping us lusting after something that is just out of reach. So Peter Bailey describes the 19th century barmaid as a perfect example of this. The bar itself acting as a physical and symbolic barrier between the punters and the attraction. This just as easily applies today to the DJ standing behind their decks, the actor or the speaker on stage, the rugby player on the pitch, or the porn stars on our screens. Number two is something called privileged inclusion, where we feel as though we are being given access to a space that others would normally be kept out of. It's why shows like MTV Cribs and Through the Keyhole were so popular, because they allowed us to see how our favourite celebrities live. And porn also gives us special access to observe acts that usually happen in private, and with that, an implied invitation that we can join in by masturbating. In those moments, it can feel as though there are no barriers to our desire being fulfilled. But then we have number 3, non-reciprocity. Watching porn is subjectively a real experience because the arousal and the stimulation are happening in our bodies and will likely feel great if we orgasm. But the impact and the influence are one way. The porn stars on screen aren't directly affected or aroused by you. And so we get to experience these fleeting moments of inclusion, only to swiftly return to our real world alone and reaching for the tissues. So I want to acknowledge that distance, privileged inclusion and non-reciprocity can be super hot. I can certainly think of many scenarios in my own life where elements of these have created delicious amounts of psychological friction. And it can feel empowering for some people to watch porn. It can give a real sense of control when you have the ability to kind of flick endlessly between videos to find your optimal turn on. It can give a feeling of freedom. We don't have to worry about offending others with our desires, or worry how long we're going to last, or how we look, or what all this means relationally. And it can give the most geographically and socially isolated people access to sex. So why does it matter if porn fits this description of parasexuality or not? For me, it matters because we are mistaking consumption for connection. Porn is primarily a form of consumption which gives us just enough of a taste of connection, but no matter how much we consume, we won't satiate our need, and connection will remain out of reach. And it matters to me because of the impact this has on our sense of power and how we show up in the world. So whilst it can seem on the surface that porn is meeting our needs, by increasing the amount of desire that is generated and felt at a distance, I believe that we paradoxically reinforce a sense of scarcity. It's like being thirsty and just looking at pictures of water. It's not going to quench your thirst, it's likely to make you more thirsty. And because we never quite get to experience that true closeness and belonging and reciprocity, a part of us remains unfulfilled. And when we feel this on some level, it's disempowering, especially when we have little capacity or influence to change that. When we can't get our true needs met, it makes us more individualistic and competitive. By keeping ourselves fired up and longing, we are way more susceptible to anything that might even marginally meet those needs. So we're more likely to numb out with substitutes such as food, alcohol and drugs, and impulse buying. It also perpetuates inequality. So those with the least are more vulnerable to messages that they aren't good enough. And if they just keep striving, and in doing so, feeding the capitalist machine, hoping that one day they will be deemed attractive enough to have their needs met. And all of us are susceptible to turning to control as a substitute for connection, which opens us up to misusing the power that we do have. So essentially, the more we consume, the more we are driven to consume. And the funny thing is that almost all of what I've said above about porn could also apply to social media. If porn cuts out the time-consuming pursuit of romantic union and replaces it with the most efficient way to orgasm, then social media killed the idea of union altogether and replaced it with organised loneliness. If porn is the smell of smoke warning us that something might be wrong, then social media is a raging inferno. The use of persuasive technology originating from social media directly exploits our desire circuitry, often without our conscious awareness. They create endless loops of seeking by stimulating desire without ever dissipating it through fulfillment, or in many cases, even enjoyment. They create new types of status power dynamics between influencers, those who have, and followers, those who want. They get our brains juiced up on desire whilst disallowing or deprioritizing content that might actually meet our needs. So this whole rabbit hole of research came about in response to my own frustration at the censorship of those of us who work in the sex industry, whether that's designing sex toys, conducting research, providing sexual services or education. Those who work in this field will know that it's like walking on a tightrope. Every day we run the risk of making a misstep in the eyes of the algorithms. Whether that's being shadow banned, which means our content doesn't show up in people's feeds, or having our social media accounts shut down without warning, or being refused access to funding or bank accounts. It's a daily battle between wanting to share our work with the world and trying to keep a roof over our heads. So why is it okay for social media platforms to tap into our reward circuitry? They're literally changing the structure and function of our brains to keep us endlessly doom scrolling. Why is it okay for sex abuse to sell pretty much anything, yet the sexuality professionals who could actually empower people to get their needs met are seemingly governed by censorship rules stricter than in the Victorian era? Censorship is preventing people from accessing educational opportunities that might help them to find their way into connection. And maybe it's the wheel of consent geek in me that leads me to question, who is this for? Who's benefiting here? And it's no coincidence in my mind that those who are getting blocked are not the big corporations or the pornified influencers, but the sexuality professionals and sex educators. Because ultimately what we are providing and teaching are possible antidotes to parasexuality. By that I mean that we are encouraging social integration. We're teaching people how to be in connection with themselves and others. We're promoting sexual accessibility for all bodies, which goes against this system of scarcity that wants to keep us consuming. We are dismantling the parasexual powers of distance and reciprocity by saying, you too can have this. I think the prospect of people actually getting their needs met is a terrifying prospect to those who currently hold the most power in our society. So what can we do about it? I think we can start individually by looking at ways in which we believe we are connecting, whether that's with ourselves, with others, with nature, with spirit, and asking ourselves, am I connecting or am I consuming? And what is the difference? I'm definitely not advocating against porn or even using social media. I'm just asking us to think about how we can bring more balance between consuming and connection, and to remember that connection can come in many different forms. And if we as sexuality professionals were allowed to share our ideas freely, we could perhaps bridge some of the gaps between porn and real world connection, combining that education and connection. So rather than people having minds full of ideas of things that they'd love to experience but no outlet for them, they could learn really valuable things such as how to communicate their desires, how to navigate bringing something new into a relationship or form a relationship with someone, how to negotiate, how to give or receive a no, and how to build in those oh so crucial ways to pause or change your mind. Censorship removes agency, and what I'd like to see is these platforms building into their design more choice for consumers around the content they see, rather than having this decided for us. And what else can you do? Keep seeking educators out in places where they can speak freely. So yes, keep coming back to sex lectures. You can also interact with content in places like our newsletters and Substacks and Patreons, places where we can share more freely. But if we want to change the world for the better, we have to start reconsidering what we take pleasure in, and to think about how we can do this together in communities like ours. There is hope. In the words of Eric Wyckoff Rogers, it is subversive to take pleasure in plentiful things. How about we make that a taboo we get turned on by?